The original Constitution is all about defining powers in such a way that the powers are not going to be dangerous to American freedoms. And at the very end, like in the last couple days, George Mason of Virginia's, George Washington's next door neighbor, proposes the addition of a Bill of Rights. Now, he happens to be the author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, so I think he has a little bit of touch of vanity, and he imagines that his handiwork from Virginia will probably just be, plucked in and stuck in. But the delegates unanimously vote against adding a Bill of Rights, but not for reasons of high principle. It was that they were tired. They'd been there for 3.5 months. They wanted to go home. And unlike George Mason, they guessed it was going to take a long time. When the first Congress gets around to a Bill of Rights, it takes months. So they go home without one, but it's the biggest mistake of the convention, because it turns out as the debates over the Constitution wear on, the absence of a Bill of Rights becomes the biggest talking point against the Constitution. People say, well, why isn't there one? What's the problem? Patrick Henry famously said, why is there no Bill of Rights? Would it have taken too much paper? He asks. Right? And so the suspicion is that the reason for there's no Bill of Rights is considerably more insidious than the lack of paper, namely that this new national government is in fact going to be a threat to people's liberties. And so back to Brutus, he says, it's really important to have a Bill of Rights, and the most express and full Declaration of Rights, he says, should have been made, but on this subject there is almost an entire silence. And people are saying, why? So this becomes a huge issue. And remember, maybe a lot of people don't realize this. I'm often stunned by this. We often think of the founders as just a bunch of white guys with wigs and things, and they all kind of agree. The Constitution was a bitter fight. It barely got passed. The margin of victory in the largest and most important state was 4 delegates out of 186. The state of New York was implacably opposed and only went along at the last minute when the other states had ratified. So the Constitution is a very close thing, and the absence of a Bill of Rights was the biggest single issue. But the defenders of the Constitution, like Madison and Hamilton, have an argument. They say, we don't need a Bill of Rights. We don't need a Bill of Rights because we did such a good job drawing the line of powers, and it's all the same thing. Powers and rights are just two sides of the same coin. And so you see here Madison arguing, or he's presenting the argument that it's unnecessary. The powers are enumerated, and it follows that all those that are not granted are retained. And so you don't really need a Bill of Rights. Hamilton goes even farther. That's not Hamilton. That's actually me standing in front of Hamilton. I'm quite a Hamilton fan. I was a Hamilton fan even before I went to the musical. So so Hamilton says not only is a Bill of Rights unnecessary, but it's also dangerous. And the reason it's dangerous is you can never list them all. Try as hard as you can, and you can never list them all. And the danger is that when you have an incomplete list, the other things it isn't just leaving the other things alone. It's that you have disparaged them. You're essentially saying this is a complete list. That's the idea. And there's actually a legal phrase we still use, which is expressio unius est exclusio alturius, meaning if you include one thing, you're excluding others. Right? It would be like you go into a park and say everybody with dogs you have to leave the park. Well, the people with cats don't have to leave the park, right? You're excluding cats when you say dogs, right? And so that's the problem. You might be excluding rights when you list, and it's impossible to get them all. And so this is this is their argument. But Madison switches sides. Oh, I should say too, there's a very amusing moment when this debate is going on in June in the House of Representatives, where a representative from Massachusetts says, well, why do we have all this detail in all of the list? And somebody says, well, these are natural rights. We're protecting our natural rights. And he says, well, if that's your principle, you need to have a lot more on the list than this. And he says, what about a man's right to take off his hat or to decide when he wakes up in the morning? Right? And so it's really kind of amusing story, except that everybody in the room knew that William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, was quite literally thrown in jail for refusing to take off his hat in a courtroom. He was on trial for something else. It's a great story. I won't give all the details, but he's on trial for something else before a judge who hates him, and the jury is going to acquit him, and the judge hates him, and Penn is a Quaker, and they refuse to take off their hats in front of earthly authorities because God is the only authority. And so he doesn't wear a hat. Penn is a smart guy. He doesn't wear a hat to court. And on the orders of the judge, just before the judge enters the room, the bailiff claps a hat on Penn's head. Judge comes in, Penn doesn't take it off, and he's held in contempt of court and sent to jail for failing to take off his hat. And so when the Bill of Rights is being debated and Sedgwick throws out this example of a trivial right, a hat, someone else says, but men have been jailed for refusing to take off their hat in the face of authority. And the message here is there's really no such thing as a trivial right. Do you know there have actually been 3 cases in the United States Supreme Court about wearing hats? Yarmulke is the most famous example, but there have been actually a Sikh turban is another example. Hats, trivial things, but you can't. This is the problem of a Bill of Rights, and this is what Hamilton is warning against. But by this time, Madison has become the leader of the movement to add a Bill of Rights. And this is mostly for considerations of electoral politics, because he wanted to be in the Senate, the first Senate, but Patrick Henry dominates the government, and so he's not going to elect him to the Senate. So he wants to run for the House of Representatives, and so this hostile Virginia legislature gerrymanders him into a district with a very large anti-federal majority where there are a large number of Baptists. And the Baptists really care about having effectual protection for freedom of religion. And Madison wins them over by promising to champion a Bill of Rights with freedom of religion. And Baptists switch over, and he's elected, and he is fulfilling his campaign promise. And so his argument is, it's true that the powers are circumcised, but even if the government keeps within those limits, it has certain discretionary powers with respect to the means, and lots of rights can be violated in this way. And he gives the example of you can have a tax law And think about a tax on merchants. That's what makes the most sense here. And in order to enforce that, well, a perfectly good way of enforcing the tax law is to break into the warehouses and make sure that people aren't smuggling. And they can break into the warehouses without a warrant, and sure enough, individual liberties have been violated. Alexander Hamilton is especially interested in freedom of the press and uses that as an example. But if you think about it, all kinds of provisions of the Constitution could be used to interfere with the press if you wanted to. I've highlighted them in red, but Helen, tell me, how can, like the very first one, the power to lay and collect taxes, how could that be used to interfere with freedom of the press?
You could tax certain, press organizations or individual journalists who aren't necessarily saying what you want them to say.
Yeah, exactly. The power to tax. You can play favorites with taxation. And we have had cases in the Supreme Court where states cleverly, it looks neutral, but when you think about it, their enemies are getting targeted. So, hey, yeah, and then each of these. Post offices and post roads looks extremely harmless, but the federal government censorship programs have all been run by the post office. Abolitionist literature was shut down by President Andrew Jackson by using the post office. The obscenity laws, federal obscenity laws, were enforced by the Postmaster General. So, the point being that the fact that the powers may have been carefully enumerated doesn't really answer the problem. And so, Brutus, carrying on, says actually, so we need a Bill of Rights anyway. The enumeration of powers wasn't good enough, but then the question becomes, what are we going to list? And Brutus gives us a conceptual answer. He says here, he's talking about the various natural rights. Some natural rights are of a nature that they cannot be surrendered. This means if surrender is synonymous with alienation, these are the unalienable rights. Right? Of this kind are the rights of conscience. That's basically religious freedom. Why would religious freedom be unalienable? Why is it a natural right you cannot give up? Why would that be?
Maybe it's because it's not within your choice. You're being held by a higher power, so you don't have the right to give that up.
In a way, yeah. So what is, freedom of religion is, well, I can tell you the definition in the Virginia Declaration of Rights. It is the duty to our Creator and the manner of discharging it. So the idea of religion is that it's not really doing what you want to do. It's doing what you have a duty to do by your own conscience. So you determine what your duty to God is, but it's still a duty. Can you give it up? If you have a duty to somebody, do you have a right to give it up?
Generally, no. That's why it's a duty.
Yeah, exactly. And so rights of conscience are like this. The right of enjoying and defending life, that's what the Declaration of Independence is talking about. We could talk about that later. It's a more complicated idea. And then he says others aren't unalienable. You can alienate them, but he says these are rights that are not necessary to be resigned in order to attain the end for which government is instituted, and therefore ought not to be given up. Now, there's some Brutus's view is you look at what the government really has to be able to do in order to accomplish its legitimate objectives, and everything else should be protected, right? So the first Congress meets and they debate, and James Madison wrote the first draft, and this is what they came up with. Familiar to everyone, I assume, here. This is the list they came up with.